Good morning. Today's lecture is about the war in Vietnam. The Cold War grows hot. Today's lecture is unique. If we were in the classroom, you would be hearing the lecture and watching the PowerPoints, of course, but every once in a while we would stop to play a piece of music from the Vietnam War era that captures some of the ideology, some of the sentiment, the ideas that were taking place during this most important of decades. Well, for copyright reasons, we can't incorporate those music videos into this lecture, but I would like to encourage you to have a second device, if you will, computer device, phone, iPad, whatever, close by. And when we get to one of those points where you see in the note guide or where I mentioned in the lecture that I would play a given song, you could go then to some kind of music service. The only one I'm familiar with is iTunes. And then you could find the song really quickly, and you could at least play without cost 60 seconds or so of that piece of music. I highly recommend that you do that. If you get the music downloaded for free because you have a monthly subscription, you could listen to the whole thing, obviously. I'll leave how you do that up to you, but I think you'll really enjoy adding the music to this lecture as we go through it. It adds a lot of meaning to the class. The 1960s were going to be a decade of change even before the Vietnam War divided America. Since World War II, the American people had been largely satisfied with the way the country was going. The economy was strong. The Great Depression and the Second World War, both traumatic events back to back, were receding into the past. In the 1950s, conservative social and political values were popular. Even the civil rights movement progressed only slowly through the 1950s and into the 1960s. Even though much needed progress, there certainly was. But in the early 1960s, the winds of change were blowing. Even before the Vietnam War came along in 1965, observers who were paying attention to the change in mood in America could notice this growing unrest. The full group, Peter, Paul, and Mary, in 1966, captured the dawn of a new era of change in their version of Blowin' in the Wind. Blowin' in the Wind was written by Bob Dylan, one of the great poets in the last half of the 20th century, and frankly, into the 21st. Dylan wrote Blowin' in the Wind in 1963, well before American involvement in Vietnam, and then the dramatic social change that engendered was a fact. Origins of the Vietnam War. In the 2 decades after World War II ended, the primary American foreign policy was containment. The attempt to stop the spread of communism in the world by containing it where it was. The Vietnam War was a direct result of the policy of containment. That policy had been forcefully expressed in Korea. Vietnam was another Asian nation that was divided between communist and non-communist forces. Though we were not militarily involved in Vietnam before the 1960s, the United States supported the anti-communist South Vietnam against communist-controlled North Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh. The situation was very similar to Korea. North Vietnam, just as North Korea, was communist-controlled. South Vietnam, just as South Korea, was aided by the United States and its Western allies. The Kennedy years. By the time John Kennedy took office in January 1961, Dwight Eisenhower departing into retirement, Some parts of South Vietnam were openly sympathetic to the communist cause. President Kennedy at this time, the early 1960s, chose to send more American weapons and U.S. military, quote, advisors to South Vietnam in order to keep the communists from taking over the country. So the advisors, the American soldiers in South Vietnam, were to advise South Vietnamese troops as to how to combat North Vietnamese aggression. And so with this sending of American advisors, American soldiers on the ground to South Vietnam, our commitment to that nation had begun. Then in November 1963, John Kennedy, as you know, was assassinated. So Lyndon Johnson and Americanization. Americanization is a key word relative to Vietnam, although it could, of course, be applied to other places in the world, but it came into prominence in the Vietnam conflict. Americanization means that Americans gradually take over the larger element of the fighting in Vietnam. When Lyndon Johnson took office, South Vietnam was clearly a nation in turmoil. I cannot emphasize this enough. It was obvious that unless Americans began to take an active role in the fighting, South Vietnam would fall to the communists. Then, when North Vietnamese patrol boats attacked the United States destroyer Maddox, a destroyer is a small warship, in the Gulf of Tonkin, just off the coast of North Vietnam, the Johnson administration used that attack as a provocation to begin a bombing campaign of the North known as Rolling Thunder. So the title of the campaign is Rolling Thunder. President Johnson at this time also went to Congress to gain approval for his policy in Vietnam. The Senate passed the so-called Tonkin Gulf Resolution by a vote of 88-2. There was no congressional declaration of war at this time, but if Johnson had sought a declaration of war from Congress, there is absolutely no doubt that he would have received that declaration of war. He just didn't ask for it. The Rolling Thunder bombing campaign of 1964 was supposed to make the political survival of South Vietnam as a non-communist nation more likely. But the truth was that South Vietnam was coming apart at the seams. The South Vietnamese central government controlled only the provincial capitals. Think of the provinces as states if you want. So the South Vietnamese government controlled only the provincial capitals. Its soldiers were deserting in large numbers, and demonstrations against that government occurred almost daily in the larger cities. In August of 1964, near anarchy reigned in Saigon. Saigon was the capital of South Vietnam. Mobs rampaged through the streets. Buddhists and Catholics waged open warfare. There were large numbers, in fact, millions of Catholics in the country because the French had been the colonial power for the better part of a century, and the French brought Catholicism to Vietnam. So Buddhists and Catholics waged open warfare, and gangs of thugs fought and pillaged with each other with hatchets and machetes. Chaos. Incredibly, American leaders believed that South Vietnam could still be trained up in democracy and provide a force against communism. In this faith, the American leaders back in Washington, D.C., ignored their experts on the ground. The people they had sent to South Vietnam to tell them what the situation really was, advised Johnson and his advisors in Washington, D.C., that this was not a salvageable situation. This was true. But Johnson ignored this professional advice. Moreover, Johnson fundamentally misperceived American interests in the region, Southeast Asia. For it did not matter to American security what happened in Southeast Asia. Even if the whole region had gone communist, there was nowhere else for the communists to go. The American 7th Fleet patrolled the oceans. China is to the north, and ultimately to the west is India. Nowhere to go. Buildup. It was not long before Operation Rolling Thunder made the air bases from which the big B-52s took off targets for attack by communist forces. I don't know about you, but if the B-52s are pummeling my country and I had the means of attacking their air bases, I think I would. And that's exactly what the communists decided to do. Now the number of well-armed regular army units in South Vietnam is growing steadily. This is not just a guerrilla warfare, guerrilla meaning a terrorist war. It's not just South Vietnamese communists and North Vietnamese communists dressed as the population waging this war. There are actually army units of North Vietnam in South Vietnam. In 1965, Johnson decided to send 40,000 more American troops to South Vietnam. These troops were another step in escalation. Johnson had previously sent Marines to guard the air bases, specifically the huge air base in Da Nang. Now Johnson in 1965 is sending 40,000 American troops, not to guard the bases, but to engage the enemy on the ground, in the jungles and in the bush of South Vietnam. This then is the real beginning of America's national nightmare. In Vietnam, the United States did not wage total war. We did not use even all of the conventional force at our disposal, let alone nuclear weapons. But rather, we tried to win this conflict without using all of those resources. Why? Well, this is a common criticism leveled against the Johnson administration and about the American effort in Vietnam, is that we simply tried to win the war with one hand tied behind our back. Why was that? Well, the reason was twofold, and there were reasons. First, Johnson doubted the American people's resolve to wage a war for South Vietnam if it required the entire mobilization of the economy and the military, as of course we had during the Second World War. Johnson doesn't think the American people will support that. And secondly, we were afraid if we did engage in an all-out war, we might trigger involvement from the Chinese in the same way that in the Korean War, our movement through North Korea helped trigger the movement of the Chinese communist forces down into that conflict. So we're afraid of a repeat of the Korean situation in which the Chinese became involved. So those are the two main reasons. The result was a misguided, half-hearted quagmire. And that was the word that was often used about the American situation in Vietnam, was quagmire. We're stuck, we can't get out, we can't win. And this quagmire in South Vietnam split America in two eventually. Doesn't happen overnight. And that will lead to defeat in Vietnam. Americanization. That is America taking over the fighting. Each month from 1965 through 1967, more and more Americans were committed to the war, always with the promise from Johnson and other leaders in the government that a few thousand more American troops would end the war. We can see the light at the end of the tunnel. This was the phrase that was commonly put out to the American people. A few thousand more troops, a few more months, maybe a year, we can see a light, the end of the war, at the end of the tunnel. But now, a full 2 years into the war, in the summer of 1967, opposition to the war grew. young people, especially those in college, began to demonstrate against the war. These people argued that we were interfering in a civil war between the communist Vietnamese of the North and the non-communist South Vietnamese. And this civil war, the anti-war protesters argued, was none of our business. Some even suggested that we were doing so for economic reasons. We were trying to profit from this conflict economically, that we were engaging in classic imperialism. The United States needed the markets of South Vietnam, and therefore we were fighting. We were spending our blood for money. But the United States was not in Vietnam for imperialistic reasons, for money, for markets. We were there to contain communist expansion, to protect the security and freedom of the United States and its allies, which included South Vietnam. But it also included South Korea and Japan in the Far East. Nevertheless, the United States' imperialist message was widely accepted by young people, and the counterculture, members of which were now known as hippies, exploded in numbers. Now again, it's not just the anti-war movement is causing this, but the anti-war movement and the war essentially in Vietnam is exacerbating the social conflict and the social change that was coming anyway. The new symbols of dissent were long hair, unusual clothing, drugs, a change of the morality of sexual morality to free sex as opposed to Christian morality regarding marriage and sex and such. And so this is when today's popular culture originated. The culture of today that we have is essentially the counterculture of the 60s and early 70s. This new culture was captured in Scott McKenzie's lyrical song, San Francisco, in 1967. The city by the bay, San Francisco, was the unofficial center of the counterculture movement. Still, it's important to recognize that the vast majority of Americans at this time supported the war against communism in Vietnam. Most Americans believe that the war was not simply a civil war. Their view of America, their view of the world, their view of the conflict was described in Merle Haggard's song, Okie from Muskogee. Haggard's song was written in response. If you listen to the lyrics of Okie from Muskogee, you will hear a reference to the hippies out in San Francisco. Okie from Muskogee was a country music in your face to the hippie movement, the Tet Offensive. But the deciding factor in the war was not to be any arguments used at home, but the surprising ability of the North Vietnamese to wage war against the strongest nation on earth. In January 1968, and 1968 is the psychological turning point of the war in Vietnam. The North Vietnamese launched the so-called Tet Offensive, which caught the U.S. off guard and resulted in the communist capture of several provincial capitals in South Vietnam. So not only do they control the countryside now, but they're beginning to take the provincial capitals. But within a few days, and this is very rarely ever remembered or noticed by historians, within a few days, the United States and its South Vietnamese allies had regrouped, recovered the lost territory in massive counterattacks, and dealt the communists horrendous casualties. For obviously now, the communists had to come out of the jungle to take these provincial capitals. And now they are fighting a war in which America can bring its artillery and its armor and its know-how and expertise into the conflict in a way they can't in the jungle. And so this actually resulted in a tremendous mistake, a military mistake on the part of the communists. For the Americans dealt the communist forces tremendous casualties, casualties that it would take 2 years to recover from. And yet we will fail to take advantage of this. What was clear after the Tet Offensive is that American leaders and the American people were under a misapprehension. We were not close to winning the war. If there was a light at the end of the tunnel, it was very small and very dim. Tet demonstrated that the communists were surprisingly strong, able to launch such an offensive. Now, middle class, red-blooded, patriotic Americans, many of the men who had fought in World War II, could see on the evening news that America was in trouble in Vietnam. After Tet, many of those patriotic Americans, not all, believed it was time to leave Vietnam to its fate and bring our soldiers home. And so America is beginning to turn away from its commitment to Vietnam psychologically. Now, March 1968, just a few weeks after the Tet Offensive, President Johnson, now very, very unpopular, declared he would not seek re-election. After all, he's the president in the midst of a war in which we are losing. The effort to win a military victory in Vietnam effectively ended when Johnson said he would not seek re-election. In November 1968, Richard Nixon, the Republican candidate, was elected president largely because he claimed to know how to end the war. Notice, not win the war, but end the war, while maintaining American honor. For Nixon, some kind of negotiated peace, that is not a military victory now, some kind of negotiated peace that preserves South Vietnam's independence was still worth fighting for. Most Americans still agreed with this. Perhaps that sentiment is best captured in Sergeant Barry Sadler's anthem, The Green Berets. But Barry Maguire's Eve of Destruction, written in 1965, spoke for an increasing number of Americans. Ending the war. Nixon's plan was threefold. Number one, Vietnamization. Well, if you remember what Americanization was, you can clearly imagine what Vietnamization is. And that is the idea that America will use less and less of its troops while the South Vietnamese will be asked to supply more and more. Two, increased bombing, designed to force the North to engage in peace talks. Bomb the North harder and harder, especially the so-called Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was the trail down from the north over which supplies and reinforcements were brought into South Vietnam. So increased bombing designed to lead to true negotiations. And then three, of course, is the negotiated peace itself that would leave South Vietnam politically intact and independent of North Vietnam. Now, after 4 more years of fighting, and imagine if you're an American soldier now fighting in South Vietnam, you're not fighting to win. You're fighting to win a negotiated peace, to achieve a negotiated peace. How do you feel about that? How do you feel about risking your life for a better negotiation position? It's a difficult sell. Well, in 1973, North Vietnam and the United States reached an agreement which brought the fighting to an end. But it did not settle the causes. All it really did was enable the United States to get its troops out of Vietnam without clearly losing the war. But everyone knew the issue would be decided by force, not diplomacy. once the United States left. Once the American forces were gone, most intelligent observers realized that at some point North Vietnam would take advantage of that fact and take South Vietnam. 2 years later, the North Vietnamese launched a major offensive which toppled the government of South Vietnam and brought all of Vietnam under control of the communists. So South Vietnam has been captured by North Vietnam, and Vietnam now is going to be united under communist control. But America was gone, and America's national nightmare was over. Well, what are the results of the war in Vietnam? The Vietnam War left deep scars on the men and women who fought it and on the nations that endured it. Returning veterans were not the heroes their fathers and grandfathers had been after World War I and after World War II, and to some extent even after Korea. Nor did the nation recover quickly. Somewhere in the Vietnam era, we lost our confidence, our belief in our essential goodness. Not until the Persian Gulf War of 1991 did the United States feel morally secure enough to engage in a significant military action. Now, I've clearly argued that we were wrong to be in Vietnam. While I did not accept any of the arguments put forward by the anti-war movement, I provided my own strategic arguments for assessing the war in that way. But the fact that we were wrong to be in Vietnam does not mean that our enemies there were morally superior. Not at all. When Vietnam invaded Cambodia shortly after uniting itself, Cambodia is one of the neighboring countries. The truth about Vietnam, the new communist regime in Vietnam, began to be clear. The communist leadership of Vietnam was committed to control of as much of Southeast Asia as they could manage. And so in its essence, the Domino Theory, the theory that the communists were intending on knocking over as many countries as they possibly could, was true, even though it was largely derided and laughed at while this conflict was going on. Oh no, it's just a civil war. The communists don't intend to expand control to neighboring countries. That was garbage. They absolutely did. The Cold Warriors in America were right about this. Well, only force would deny them control of Southeast Asia, the Vietnamese, and eventually, surprisingly enough, history is full of irony, the Chinese eventually contributed to controlling Vietnam. The lessons of the Vietnam War are that the United States must be sure that its foreign policy is, number one, guided by its essential national interests. Number two, by public opinion. The American people must support any foreign venture, and not by just a 51-49 call, but by significant majority. And three, by the prospects for success. Now, there are some wars in which you have no choice whether the prospects for success are good or not. You're fighting for your very life. So disregard prospects for success. But not in a situation like Korea or Vietnam. And so our prospects for success have to be considered. How much will it cost? How long will it take? How much blood will be spilled? Upon careful analysis, American involvement in Vietnam failed all three criteria. First, the loss of all of Southeast Asia to the communists would not have adversely affected our national security. Second, public opinion, and Johnson freely admitted this, public opinion was not sufficiently informed or supportive of a long conflict. And third, any reasonable assessment of our prospects for success after 1963 could only have been negative, and they were negative by the experts on the ground. In short, we were wrong to go to Vietnam, not because the communists there were really fine fellows. They weren't. But because Vietnam was of no value to us. And because we could not succeed in our goal with any reasonable amount of force. After years of trying to forget Vietnam, Americans decided to remember. In Washington, D.C., the nation built a memorial to those Americans who had fallen in Vietnam. It is still the most visited monument in the nation's capital. And then in 1989, the Statler brothers wrote a really emotional ballad, Name on a Wall. And this song captures the meaning of the wall for the generation of Americans that fought the Vietnam War. Well, I thank you for your kind attention, and God bless you all.